I really, in thinking about Hughie Lee-Smith's work and his progression and sort of his relationship to various movements and the country, I don't know how often I think about him with the Harlem Renaissance. What I do think about is this movement in a way, and how he spent time really all across the US, you know, born in Florida, spent some early formative years in Atlanta with his grandmother, and then went to the Midwest, Cleveland, with his mother, and was spent a lot of time in that part of the country. So really thinking about that, and how that's actually where he took art classes as a young child, and also was winning awards even as a kid, and really clearly had this talent, but also was being fed into by his mother, by his family, really supporting that. And so really thinking about that in the shape of who his influences and who were some of the people, not even influences, but who was around him as he was very much developing as a young artist.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the work when you walked in terms of early beginning, as we walk right through it, Nathaniel?
My first instincts were around the idea of space and that sort of composition, controlling how the audience can interact with the landscape, the background, foreground, all these things coming together to kind of articulate a sort of emotion. He was trying to evoke sort of that loneliness or individuality that is captured in painting like the birds or young man, Untitled, and he's holding the ball, or the amorphous sphere. These all are kind of trying to control how we interpret ourselves as the viewer on a one-on-one stance.
Yeah.
And that progresses in terms of from his early stages of work to the later stages in the 1970s, I would say. Right. And that work was more about everyone else experiencing that aloneness as well, versus just being one-to-one experiences.
Mm-hmm. Amber?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you position it. You're starting us off with thinking about him in relation to a community, right? Because like Nathaniel, I feel like so much of what I see in these paintings is about alienation. And so sort of there's that question of how does the figure relate to the landscape, but there's also the question of what are the tools that one has to think about belonging. And so for me, I sort of shared this before, one of the things that I find really fascinating about all of the paintings is the investment in clothing. Partially because it makes us, not only because it gives us insight into questions of respectability and class mobility, especially in terms of thinking about race in this particular moment, right, which he was certainly engaged in, but also just more generally kind of what is fashion as a theoretical concept, right? Because this is not like the fashion of Fashion Week. This is like fashion that is meant to kind of anchor someone into a particular location, right? Maybe they're disappearing into the clothes. We're often seeing the clothes, but not the person.
Yeah.
And so just sort of thinking about what that means. And I said that in relation to the Harlem Renaissance, where I think so much of our, at least historical memory of that moment is all of these vibrant conversations, right? And interactions and maybe some sex but intimacies. And these are so severed from that it's an interesting juxtaposition, right?
Yeah.
And I would also say that in thinking about the Harlem Renaissance, we also can position it within a larger arc of a search for a Black genealogy and thinking about what is Blackness itself, which is also not necessarily, what I see at work here, right? There's very much, I'm not gonna go so far as to call it a post-racial sense, but that investment in understanding what race is doing it's very different.
Yeah, and that sense of isolation, or I would say even removed from emotion, was the right into the center of the Great Depression as the prevalent sense of social movement in a way, because that's when I would say the WPA came into being. a lot of these images, painted images, really echo that period very prominently when you think about social realism. Coinciding with the beginning of WPA was an invention that really was so progressive. When you think about when it created in 1935, it lasted 43, I think. So it's just 8 years that it lasted. But one of the most important thing of the WPA was Federal Project. You might have heard of it. It's called Federal Project 1, which have 5 different projects into it. There's federal art, there's federal music, federal theater, federal writer, and I think it's called something like survey records, you know, which is part of community building, keeping archive and whatnot. But what is so interesting for me was the person who ran it for a while, a man named Roger Cahill, who was married to Dorothy Miller, who was a chief curator at MoMA at the time, and which allows so many artists to be put in use, you know, painted mural in public places, high school, railroad, you know, library, including all the things that similarly, you know, apply to writers and poets too. And I think I was so interested to put in that context because somewhere I read that when he was at Cleveland Art Museum, he was very taken by Albert Pinkham Ryder, that his favorite painting was, I think it's called Death on Horse, which is a very haunting painting that Ryder had made. And thinking about Ryder, I don't know, some of you might remember, but when Pollock was asked among the modern, American master, who he admired the most was Albert Pinkham Ryder. And there's one in the Met right now, you can see it, it's called Moonlight Marine. It's 11 inches by 11, it's very small. So you look at that early painting, self-portrait right there, the mood painted, I can't help but to think of late Cézanne too. You know, the boy, you know, portrait of his son really. There's one in the Bourne Foundation. So there's a lot of incredible pressure, compressed space and mood, because Ryder was known for also sense of scale. So I'm interested in the sense of scale as you and I was going through it, how unpredictable the sense of scales were in its painting. You mentioned about framing through fashion, to clothing, but then we think about composition. Isn't that part of it? So I would like to ask a little bit about that, because when you look at the iconographies, the early iconography, this so-called desolated urban decay with bricks and whatnot, you know, falling apart. But they have a certain aspiration of a landscape, an idealism of a landscape, you know. And then it moved through the city slowly, but it goes back and forth so much that you see here. And you and I was talking about how he invented it. It's painting from imagination. It wasn't like directly from life, although you know that portrait of that young boy and his self-portrait is painted from life. But many are invented painting. What do you think about that, Lauren?
Yeah, I think definitely, even though one of the things that I'm struck by that they are invented, I almost feel like I recognize so many places, right? I almost feel like, oh, I feel like I know where that is, but I also think what it is I'm connecting with the feeling that is coming from the paintings and this idea of sort of loneliness, the desolation, abandonedness, and also this idea of, in so many of the paintings, it's, did we just miss what's happening or is something about to happen? And how is action really being moved through and how is it set up? So I'm often sort of trying to decide, okay, wait, did that just happen or did that happen a while ago? Or is it really, is the movement, is the action, is it going to? And I think each painting, every time I look at it, I change my mind about where that is. And I think that just speaks to the power of the image and the power of his ability to sort of set a scene and give something away, but also really not tell us exactly what we're supposed to be seeing or where we're exactly supposed to be because it isn't real. It's not a real place.
So there's a sense of familiarity,
Yes.
even though we can't exactly identify.
Pinpoint, exactly, right.
Right. Okay. Nathaniel?
I like that setup where we're talking about scenes because that kind of controls like your relationship to things. It's very curated. I think that he still desires to capture something beautiful in the destruction. You know, he returns back to that. And based on like proportions of landscape to figure, you can tell that he loves landscapes much more than he does figures. You know, he's much more invested in that. He thinks that that's more capturing. This is all I'm assuming. I don't know him like that, but you know, the work speaks for itself. I also think about the desire for like this one piece where you're coming to it from the other side of a river, and you can see that the building is demolished already, and it's already blending back into the former landscape. I think that that's like a full, like, you know, 360 sort of thing towards like the romanticized views of like demolished structures and the return to that to adorn it and give it sort of a re-life, revamp.
Right. Amber, do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I love what everyone is saying. It's so smart. And, I think one of the things, I feel like this scale produces this kind of, because the figures aren't available, partially also because we're often not facing their face, what we have to affect to is the landscape, which does then invite like these perpetual, I don't know, it invites you to project onto it and to sort of imagine like what is your own relationship with this kind of, you know, these landmarks of desolation, and also just, especially because we get such an encapsulated view, right? Like we see a lot. But one of the things that I keep coming back to is something that Clemence mentioned, which is that the factory, like the repetition, I mean, there are repetitions of a lot of things that I'm sure we'll keep talking about, but one of them that I had not noticed until she pointed it out was there's a factory, because it looks like it's like a specific factory, but then it's actually the same one, and it becomes this kind of like Where's Waldo situation where you're like, where's the factory now? And I think, I mean, I also personally do some work in psychoanalysis, but I think there's something very interesting about sort of like why does this repeat, and just kind of thinking about, because the paintings are so opaque, right, it becomes this sort of like, you know, what exactly is going on. And for me, I'm thinking about not necessarily his work with the WPA, but that he did spend a lot of time in Detroit where there were a lot of union drives going on, and sort of thinking about, you know, what is going on? Is this saying something about labor and the state of factory work or manufacturing? And just sort of thinking about like, what does that mean as a place in one's psyche that is sort of, you know, we get the whole factory, like that is kind of distant, but, you know.
Well, they are certainly invented imageries. It's not something that he, you know, they're painting directly from nature, although he may have made drawings from nature, from direct observation, and then accumulated them and reconstruct them in a certain specific framing. I think framing is a key to understand how he constructs these figures. And within the space, I would argue for the deliberate positioning of profile, of frontality. Often they are very static. Often they are anchored into their specific space. I mean, of course, there's reference to surrealism, to the chirical, that sense of isolation, explicitly devoid of human activities, but they are theatrical. And I know there have been literature written in reference to Balthus, which is very interesting too. Balthus is the only painter in that period where insistent on painting the figure when everyone else was making cubism. I mean, it's so interesting that Picasso is the only one who really supported Balthus. You know, in 35, 36, he became Balthus as a young man. And I know that he had an affection for Balthus, and you can see that sense of stage-like, you know, construction, framing the figure they are unspoken, but there's a lot of things going on. If you look at that painting, for example, a lot of, for the left figure standing away from us, one facing frontal to us and one in profile. So you see the movement of the so-called space in between them, and a lot of architectural motif is actually re-echo. I mean, he made theater stage set too, don't forget that, doing part of the work for WPA. So I think the painting there is also very artificially constructed, very similar to the one with the prefigure there. But I want to shift a little bit in terms of the sense of, I think, color. I think the color is very interesting. From muted palette, earth gray, very much Renaissance, or even the Babylon school, maybe some reference to Hopper, you know, reference to Balthus, which I mentioned. But then it changes. They are not identifiable sense of light. We can't really easily detect what time of the day. So you and I was talking about that, Nathaniel.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate more on that a little bit?
I think that ambiguity brings you back to like sort of a purgatory limbo state, which relates to like surrealist ways of like depicting spaces. Like you have this vast space, misty, you can't see the end of it, you don't know where the beginning is, and you're just there, like finding yourself. So like, for instance, the birds, that's like on the cover for the invitation, I think. And that one, I think, focuses on like that sort of control of the limbo, like giving us like very concrete like parameters, as if like we are to understand the fence and the cement area as like where we can go, where we can't go. But then the birds allude to like the escape of that space and pushes it further into the idea of the unknown. Like you don't know where the landscape is at that point, versus like everything else, the landscape is very defined. There it loses that sense of like presence and falls into a space where you feel like you blend in with that sort of ambiguity. Like the figure there is lost in that space.
Right. Lauren?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything more poetic than that to add. I think for me it very much does have that feeling of a dream state in a way, the sort of colors that you would see where everything is a bit muted and you're not really sure, you're not quite awake, you're not asleep, but it is somewhere in between that.
Yeah. Amber?
I know, I mean, Nathaniel, what? You did such a great, that was just so beautiful. I guess I will just, I don't know, I'm gonna go to the ribbons, I guess. Just to think about sort of what's different, because in all of this dreaminess, right, that we're kind of like invited into and lulled into, it's interesting that there are these like, where interruption comes, it's either in the motifs of the ribbons or the balloons,
right.
Which are kind of always, I mean, you know, they're definitely more muted, like in that one over there, they're still blue, they're still within the color palette. But just sort of thinking about, I guess, you know, what work they're doing to puncture the scene aesthetically, and just, you know, adding that kind of that touch of irreality that makes you think more surrealism than realism, right? So if it's all imaginary, they're just sort of like bring us even closer over the edge to that kind of, but what is happening?
Yeah, I was also thinking about when things are constructed to be stationary, it's a way to anchor space, a way to frame in how can read the narrative, however opaque it might be. But then you see occasionally there's playfulness. For example, throughout the works, if you look closely, there always a certain ribbons, a certain finesse, ornate sense of playing with that incredible exquisite, you know, ephemeralness, you know, whether it's, you know, hanging in the sky, whether it's, for example, over here, wrapping around the figure, the torso that lean on top of that edge in the landscape, really, or her ribbon, her head. There's a lot of that going on throughout the work, and that make me think about immediately that he must have had a sense of awareness what was going on coming to New York, because the insistence to paint the way he had in the midst of abstract expressionism, particularly in the 50s, you know, abstract expressionism became a full-blown movement by the late 40s, 48 to be more exact. So that's when he came to New York, back and forth, and he stayed on course painting the figure. Just as I mentioned about the way that Barthes insisted painting the figure during the avant-garde years of France, Paris, particularly, when everybody was making cubism, you know? So that to me is fascinating, how he insisted on painting the figure the way he had started out. And I wanted to ask whether that's an act of defiance, stubborn, or so-called surrender to the vision. Do you know what I mean? I think that's a very interesting way to think about somebody who insisted on surrendering to their vision. And it seemed to me that's what's happening here throughout the course of his career. It's very consistent.
It is consistent, and you can also see the growth and the development, which is one of the things that I love about how the exhibition here is arranged, because you can very much see a progression and see a change, though there is such a commitment to his vision, commitment to the style that he has created, but he still plays within those boundaries, right? And he still evolves and still has work that he's doing in that space. So I feel like that could also speak to why he sticks with it, right? Because he's still evolving, he's still very much developing his craft, and you can see with the earliest work and then the latest work, I don't necessarily know if these two paintings, you know, hanging side by side, would you automatically think they were by the same person?
Right.
So that, I think, speaks to how he developed as an artist throughout his career, and was still able to do that without switching styles or doing what was in vogue or moving just because that's what others were doing.
What about sense of touch? This is something I think also very interesting. We go back to iconography again, but I wanted to bring up this, you know, the issue of touch, because I think throughout the course of looking at the work here, there are different ways of painting. I mean, he certainly painted on canvas. He also painted on masonite, and sometimes fairly in pastels, fairly thick. Sometimes it's thin, deliberately painted in a variety of ways. You mentioned the word sfumato.
Yeah, smoky distance. That just related back to like aftermath. And there's a couple other pieces in terms of like how he goes about painting his like more distant landscapes that really push you into like being in the foreground. For instance, I wanted to go back to talking about like the ribbons. I feel like that's the presence of like life, evidence of life, so to speak. There is like writing in that piece as well, and you don't see that in the other pieces. So like that's another change in direction in terms of like touch and intention. At this point, he's like, you know, writing on the surface. It's no longer a painting, it's a paper. And he writes Tina. At first I thought it was Viva, but that's neither here nor there. But essentially it's a moment where he's talking about his daughter, Christina. And this is like kind of like a celebration in a way, which I think is weird, not weird, peculiar in relation to like the celebration around like the Harlem Renaissance periods, spaces that he wasn't truly in action with, but still I feel like this is like a moment of having like a sort of conversation with that dynamic where the reality is like the slums is where you're celebrating.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Like the aftermath of Mardi Gras is not like a, you know, Beckenham Palace place. You know, it's very grungy. And I think that kind of reflects back into like how the paintings are used here, like to express that sort of thing. Also, I would say that the touch changes from like more personified figures, and then how that like translates into the figure just being an instrument in the composition rather than like the self-portrait of the students. The one figure, you could perceive it as like a young Lee-Smith if you wanted to, but you don't have to. But like all these things, like that is more intentional. Like there's a desire to capture this person and bring them to a space where you want to title them almost, versus in the other ones, you're more so involved with like landscape. You're not thinking about like, oh, what is she doing on top of this building? Like, you're like, you're more so just involved with like, do I feel like that, you know?
Yeah. Amber?
I don't know that I have much to say about touch, but I'm interested in this question of the figures, and I think a lot of what you're saying in terms of do I feel that way in the landscape, or the figure as kind of offering us an anchoring in space, makes me think, I mean, so he was a dancer for a while in his youth, and I think for me a lot of that feels like that's, you know, as a dancer, one is using one's body as kind of, you know, mapping coordinates in space, and as kind of more of an analytic than necessarily like a thing to be looked at in that particular way. And so I'm wondering if we might draw some kinds of links between the dancerly use of the sense of embodiment and choreography and the way that the figure is circulating here, where it is about like, if dancing wants to make you feel like what it would be to be having these feelings in these spaces, right? It's a transformed space. It's very different. Because one of the things that really struck me is that so often when we think about, especially racialized figures, and thinking about like bodies and flesh, there's so much more sexualization and so much more violence, or sort of, there's just a lot more like visceralness. And so that kind of coldness and that abstract, that it's not abstract because they are figures, but that kind of thinking about the figures as like offering us insight into emotional landscapes, I think is continuous with a choreographic project.
Yeah, I guess what we trying to describe would be the word enigma. And I know that my friend Lowry Stokes Sims happened to write a beautiful essay on it, who I haven't seen in a while. I think she moved to Baltimore, but I will be seeing her some point soon. I don't want to misquote Lowry, but she wrote in the essay, in keeping his sense of even-handedness of destiny, of karmic paths, Lee-Smith demonstrates in many aspects of his work an acute awareness of the irreducible and reversible roles of the oppressed and the oppressor, the privileged and the deprived in the grand scheme of things. And that made me think of the subtle political implication in the work. And that to me is very interesting. Particularly that painting over there, it seemed to me that everybody's looking to the right in profile, where the middle hold up with the painted mask confronted our viewer, and the balloon and the strong horizontal line right behind there. And that's a very, very challenging picture, very provocative imagery. And I don't know how to read it, so I would like to invite you to just give me a sense what you think of it. Because I look at that when I first came in, I'm looking at it now, and I can't really wrap my head around it. I can't grapple the complexity of the psychology of those imagery, these figures. Let's talk, shall we? Yeah. You know, Lauren?
Do you want to okay.
You know, I think about that work, particularly in thinking about his later work and work that he made near the end of his career and the end of his life. And I also have these thoughts and this idea about just what we're talking about, right? Like everything that's happening in the world is coming through in the work, even if it's not so overt, right? So really thinking about what was happening in the world, what was the political situation, what was he also trying to say in a way that maybe he had yet to say in a work, this idea that you sort of get to a point where you can say what you want to say, you can do what you want to, and I think similar to so many of the other works, there's so much and a lot to interpret, though we see more common and sort of familiar signs. So the balloons, again, make an appearance, the other sort of idea that have been throughout the work, but then you see, you know, a fist and what that means and the imagery that comes to that in a way that we've not really seen throughout the
Yeah.
other work. So it
Yeah.
definitely, to me, takes it to a different space where there is almost this idea of, is he making a comment? Is he talking about Black Power? Is this really the focus of this work in a way that has not necessarily been so
Yeah.
overt or present in the other works?
Right.
But you can't deny that. I also think there's a way in which even the treatment of the skin color of the subjects is a little different than before. So I feel
Yeah,
like as
yeah.
we're talking about color and sort of coming back around to that, this
Yeah.
work, the later works feel very different
Yeah.
in those respects.
Absolutely. It's particularly the left figure who held up a piece of paper to conceal his face in profile, in reference to the Fisk right in the middle.
Just segue into that, I think that is a moment of like a private conversation. Mic turn on. And like, I think that's even further into the secrecy of like Black dialect, the coded languages that we use to like survive in this America. I was also thinking about the balloons. This is a moment where the balloons are very prevalent versus the other pieces around us today. And back in contrast, they're like actually facing each other like a duel.
Right. The one in the foreground, yes.
The balloons there, they're on the ground, they're not elevated. So there isn't the same like hope and celebration around it. It's not as optimistic. While this one, I feel a lot more of sort of a lost hope in this piece, because like the balloon is floating away. It's no longer a part of the, communal celebration. And that could, be analogous to the, Black experience in some extent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Want to add to that, Amber?
Yeah, I mean, so lately I've been very interested in what was happening in the 80s and 90s with regards to race relations. And so I want to read it as like a critique of multiculturalism, and sort of thinking about just sort of like the absurdity, right? Like there's sort of the wearing of the gesture's head. So there are these symbols of that we could read as like, signs, sort of at this point, past signs of racial pride or movement. But it's sort of unclear that anything has happened. And we sort of, we could read like the balloons are there's just sort of this, it feels so absurd, and I agree with that sense of like hope being lost.
Yeah,
but it also feels like there's a certain leaning into the spectacle, but also acknowledging that the spectacle is ridiculous, right? And so that's what that makes me feel like that it's so vibrant, but not embraced.
Yeah, and then there's a question of tenderness. I think that it's discreet, it's very subtle. I mean, you look at that portrait of the young boy and right into the portrait of that young girl with her hand propped up under her chin on the lap there. I mean, clearly he's been thinking about, when you think of, maybe social realism in America at the time, but then you think of blue period of Picasso, the period where he identifies so much of being poor, being a marginal figure. It's only lasted a few years, but it was so strong. And then when Picasso broke through from that impoverty, which is closure of human gesture, they're very thin mostly, and have their enclosed arm around torso, but when entering the next phase, which is the rose period, where the exuberant of human gesture expanding out, and the palette changed because he had spent time with carnival circus performers. It's so interesting. I think that somehow, he must have thought about those, contexts of European modernism, particularly Picasso. And I also think very close observer, acute observer of Piero del Francesca, probably even Giotto, because I was thinking of coming back from Boston, having seen the Philip Guston show. So Guston is the same contemporary of Lee-Smith, and who also have spent time in Italy. But just looking at that painting again, the profile treatment, I can't help but being reminded, as you remember the betrayal of Christ in the Reina Chapel of Giotto, where Christ and Judas are painted in profile, looking at each other, no more than half an inch away from their face, as if one is looking at the other and say, which one screw up here? You know, the confrontation is so aggressive, but yet it's so subtle. And I think in a way, you see that throughout in the way he depicts his figure. So it's amazing. I mean, I don't know how to describe it, except for just prolonged viewing. Maybe we'll discover other things. Okay, the last question is iconography, and then we'll open up to the audience. Occasionally you see, for example, the target. We already talked about the balloons. There's other things, you know, the ribbons and whatnot. But the target appear here, for example, below. The boy is looking past it, or perhaps at the target. Over there on the stage, there's a target also on the easel, with a checkerboard right below, and then somewhere else that it appeared too. Yeah, right. And so I want to ask, what is that about? Why target? You know, is it Jasper Johns? Is it pop art? Is it minimalism? You know, 1970? I don't know how to describe it. I think it's emblematic again. It's very strange. Is it only the way to trap in the eye? Is it compositional device, you know? So it's very mysterious to me.
I don't know. I mean, I think like so many of the references and the iconography in the works, there are multiple ways that we can read into it and really think about it. Is this the idea sort of in thinking about a target, you know, is he aiming at something? Is it sort of like this idea of like bullseye, like we're gonna hit the target? Is the target on him? Is it on the work? Is it on someone?
Right.
So it feels like there's a lot of ways to think through what it could be, and it could also mean the different ways that it's deployed also is fascinating, because sort of in this one, it's almost in a spot where you would see, okay, is that weapon actually going to hit the target? Is that sort of there? But then with the three figures on the easel, is it a work of art? Like, what is it? Yeah.
Right, right.
I was interpreting the targets as like sort of a quiet revolt. Like if you think about like graffiti and like the use of graffiti, it's very youthful and very based on like rebellion and new ideas. And then another like analogous metaphor to put onto this is sort of like being goal-oriented or having ideals, and those being things that you're trying to like aim for. You may not hit your mark all the time, you know? Especially in this moment, it feels like the target is something that you're learning from. It's on the stage, it's facing you, and it's also a part of like the bigger conversation of the three figures to the right, sort of pushing the narrative, and also color. Wow, I just realized that the colors kind of play with the ring. Yeah, but that further imposes the statement in terms of like being goal-oriented, having ideals, and trying to strive for them.
Yeah. Your last words, Amber?
I can't believe these are going to be the last words, but I mean, I think we might, for some reason, that one in particular makes me think about the way that we could also think about the target in relation to the carnival, and sort of like the game playing, which is sort of connected to the graffiti situation, right? But just, I think, especially there, it's feeling like an invitation to play. I mean, in some of the other ones, it feels more like, I don't know, the carnival came to town and like left everything bad. But, which I think, you know, I think that's the thing with the cohesiveness of, I don't know that the ribbon, balloon, and target, say, are always working to present like one cohesive version of a carnival. I think sometimes they're working at odds with each other to sort of show that, you know, this, whatever that is meant to represent, actually has a lot of internal tension. And so some of it may be moving in this particular way to like bring things together, and there's always something that's going to be kind of tearing it apart a little bit. That, yeah.
Yeah, so anyway, I would conclude that what compelled me about the work is the politics of tenderness, the politics of the community, and the determination to refuse to be spoon-fed, to be understood immediately. And I think that that's what prolonged the hidden drama, the part that has yet communicated in language and in gesture, in human physiognomy, among other things.